This is where the dance floor will be tonight, so I hope that everyone drinks up and joins me here later on this evening. At this time, it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Nicolas Cartier. He is the Corporate Vice President of Industrial Microbiology.
Thank you. I think I have to lower the mic. Randy, you're going to have to bring it up again. I'm sorry. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you tonight in this beautiful museum. I hope you enjoy the place. As you said, for a little while, it's going to be without new drinks. I'm really sorry. We at bioMérieux, we are really proud to be partner of IAFP for so many years. We're even more proud to be your partner in food safety, your partner in this fight we make together every day to try to ensure that people around the world can be confident the food they eat is safe. This year IAFP is in Salt Lake City. For us at bioMérieux, it's not any city in the US. It's the place where we now have our hub for molecular biology. It's the place where a company named BioFire, which is probably the most successful adventure in recent years in the diagnostics industry, is based. And therefore, it's my great pleasure to leave the floor to the person who's been one of the founders of this company, who's been its CEO for so many years, my colleague, my friend, Randy. I leave you the floor. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you, Nicola. It's great to be here with all of you. I was really pleased to get this invitation from the industry group, and I'm really honored to be able to talk to this group because I have so much respect for the work that you guys do. You're part of a multi-generational war against infectious disease, and the results of that war have just been overwhelmingly positive, and really one of the great successes in the history of humankind. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit. But first I'd like to mention that, that we joined bioMérieux just 4.5 years ago, and it's been great to be part of a terrific company. It's, I feel like we're the next link in a long chain of contributions that bioMérieux has made to the fight against infectious disease. One of the things I really love about bioMérieux is that in their product line and in our family of products, you can see the three, what I think are the three most important innovations in the history of diagnostics. So the first of those innovations was the identification of bacterial pathogens by culture. So you can't go in any building in France without seeing a picture. Any of the bioMérieux buildings in France have a picture or a bust of Louis Pasteur. So he was one of the founders of microbiology, and among many of his accomplishments, he provided the first direct evidence for the germ theory of disease. If Nobel Prizes had been awarded at that time, I think he would have gotten 3 or maybe 4 Nobel Prizes for his various accomplishments. I mean, his career is really remarkable. And within bioMérieux, there's a very well-known photo. And it shows an aging Louis Pasteur, and he is surrounded by his students. And one of those students is Marcel Mérieux. And he started a 4-generation tradition of fighting infectious disease that still goes on today. And if you just go down the street to our new building, it's named for Marcel's grandson, Alain Mérieux, who was the founder of bioMérieux. And if you look in the bioMérieux product line, you'll see plates, you'll see blood culture bottles, you'll see Vitek cards. These are all things that would be immediately recognizable to Pasteur as having evolved from his original insight that you could take an invisible amount of bacteria and grow it up into a large visible colony that you could easily identify. And 170 plus years later, it's still an invaluable technology that we all use every day. So the second great innovation, I believe, in diagnostics was the immunoassay. And that was developed by a woman, Rosalind Yarlow, in the 1950s. And really one of my first jobs in a laboratory was turning a radio immunoassay into a newfangled enzyme-linked immunoassay. Okay? And here we are today still using this great specificity of antibodies to identify pathogens and to identify toxins. And still valuable today, 70 years after she invented it. And many of you, I know, use the VITA system to identify Salmonella, Listeria, E. coli. And this has directly evolved from Rosalind's initial invention 70 years ago. And the third diagnostic innovation, and the one closest to my heart, is the polymerase chain reaction. So that was invented in the 80s by a crazy scientist in a little company in California. Rumor has it he was taking LSD at the time. And imagined how he could take the enzymes that are responsible for replication of the DNA inside your cells and put it into a tube and then temperature cycle it up and down over and over again. And by doing this process, we could take as little as a single molecule of RNA or DNA, expand it up to 1 billion molecules. That's super easy to see and super easy to identify. And BioFire was actually started in 1991 as a company devoted to PCR because we saw that it looked like a really interesting technology that might be valuable, but it seemed like the instrumentation sucked and the chemistry sucked, and there were a lot of things that could be done to make it more useful. And we dove into that in the early days, and really all of our products have been related to PCR. And it's the heart of our flagship product, the Polymerase system, that I was able to show a few of you earlier today. And it's also at the heart of the GeneUp system that the industry unit sells. And GeneUp, by the way, uses what I think is a beautiful little thermocycler that was developed at BioFire Diagnostics. So you should, if you haven't looked at it, you should take a look at it. So at any rate, back to Polymerase. So what we did with Polymerase was we took PCR and we nested it. So we did 2 rounds of PCR where you could boost up the concentration of everything. And that allowed us to simultaneously detect a lot of different pathogens at the same time. And the way we use this is we look for syndromes. We look for sets of symptoms that are really similar symptoms, but are caused by lots of different organisms. So, for example, upper respiratory infections all look the same, but they can be flu, they can be viruses, they can be bacteria. They all look the same. For the physician, it's really difficult to tell those apart. So we package them all in a single test, and the physician can just order that test and immediately figure out what's wrong with that patient. And this makes a huge difference. It prevents them from doing additional unnecessary testing. It prevents them from putting them on drugs they don't need. And this has been super popular in hospitals and is really revolutionizing the way hospitals think about testing for respiratory infections, GI infections, blood infections, brain infections, and pneumonia. And it's been really great to see the progress that this system has made. So within bioMérieux, you get this great mix of venerable old methods like culture that I think will always be valuable, always be useful, and new niches exploited by Polymerase that bring added capabilities for just the right application. And we're in a great position, all of us, to sort of pick and choose between those, picking the right technology for the job we have in our fight against infectious disease. And I think there's few fights more important than the fight against infectious disease. The level of suffering caused by infectious disease in the past is impossible for us to imagine now. So I just had the pleasure of going to my grandmother's 100th birthday party. She threw out a pitch at a baseball game. So when she was born, there was about a 30% chance that she would not live to see her first birthday. So imagine the suffering and the heartache in a world where 1 in 3 of your children, 1 in 3 of your grandchildren don't make it out of infancy. I mean, that was the world that she was born into. When she was born, her life expectancy was 48 years. 48. Right? And the problem behind those terrible statistics was infectious disease. Fortunately for her and for me, that era was ending just as she was born. So I've been reading Steven Pinker's new book, Enlightenment Now. It's really terrific. I've enjoyed it a lot. And in Enlightenment Now, Steven Pinker shows in chart after chart how much the world has improved because of a few hundred years of the application of the scientific method to our problems. And it's really amazing. My favorite little tidbit is that in the last 100 years, your chances of dying from a lightning strike have decreased 47-fold. So if we can solve the lightning strike problem, it really makes you feel like you could solve anything. But of all the improvements he talks about, none are more important, none more remarkable, none more striking than the improvements in human health. So over the last 100 years, our life expectancies worldwide have doubled, and the rate of infant mortality has fallen by a factor of 100. These are terrific accomplishments. So I was reading a recent JAMA article that talked about the details of this. And if you look at just infectious disease, the rate of infectious disease mortality has fallen 20-fold since 1900. That's an amazing decline, and there's never been anything like it in human history. And I had this beautiful graph, but Kim wouldn't let me show it to you guys. So I'll have to describe it to you. And it's really interesting. It shows this exponential decline in the rate of infectious disease. But it also has a few little idiosyncrasies that I thought were kind of fun. So in 1918, off of a huge base of infectious disease death, there was a gigantic 100% spike in infectious disease mortality rate. Anybody know what that was? Yeah, the Great Flu Epidemic associated with World War I. Right? And then in the 80s and 90s, there was about a 5-10% bump up. Any guesses? Yeah, HIV. Yeah, that's right. And I think those are really interesting because they show us that we've made great gains, but constant vigilance is required, right? We're not done yet. And if you look at sort of the remaining little level of infectious disease, that's also kind of interesting. There's a couple of diseases that are going up right now. So West Nile disease is going up. And there's a diarrheal illness, C. difficile, that's been going up. So we've got to keep an eye on this. This battle is not won. We have to constantly be at it. If you look in that last little remaining tail, about 40% of it is actually lung infections. So viruses and bacteria infecting either your upper or your lower lung. And two of the panels that I think we're most proud of at BioFire test for viruses and bacteria that cause those infections. And so we're hoping we can make a little dent in that curve over the coming years. So I think most of us feel like we know the story of this dramatic decline in infectious disease. There was this miracle decade between 1935 and 1944 where medical practice was changed forever by the discovery of antimicrobial properties of sulfonamides in Germany, of penicillin in Great Britain, and streptomycin in the United States. So an example of the impact of these drugs is in something that was called childbed fever. So in 1930, when my grandma was just thinking about having kids, about 1 in 500 births resulted in the death of the mother from childbed fever. And we now know that was caused by a species of streptococcus. And antibiotics immediately drove that rate down to almost zero. Okay? Just a terrific story, a terrific change. But surprisingly, the miracle of antibiotics is not the story of the miraculous decline in infectious disease over the last 100 years. If you look at the graph of the decline, over 90% of the decline had already taken place before the first antibiotic was discovered. 90%. If you look at the graph really closely, you can't even see the slope of the curve changing with the introduction of antibiotics. You don't see any effect. So I'd like to argue that the end of infectious disease in the 20th century is not a story of curing infections, it's a story of preventing infections. And that's a story that you guys are all an integral part of. Changes were made at the turn of the century that correlate much better to this reduction. And those two changes resulted in two important things: pure water and pure food. So first, I'll start with water. Abel Wolman is not a famous guy. I looked him up on Wikipedia. His entry is less than 1 page. Okay? He didn't win a Nobel Prize. Fleming did for penicillin. He wasn't offered a ticker tape parade in New York City like Fleming was, but he was too modest. He declined it. But the Science Hero website, which is a fun website, you should visit it, it estimates that his invention of proper chlorination of water has saved 177 million lives, and still counting. So he was an engineer. He graduated from Johns Hopkins in 1913. And water system people in water systems kind of knew that chlorine might be useful for disinfection, but they were having a really hard time handling it. And they didn't know how to use it. They didn't know it's poisonous if you put in too much. The water tastes terrible if you put in too much. You kill people if you don't put in enough. So they were really hesitant to use it. And he came up with a very precise formula that took into account the organic load of the water and the pH of the water and the taste of the water, and gave them exact instructions for how to chlorinate water. And he transformed the water system of Baltimore. And Baltimore's water system became a model for the rest of the world. It was copied everywhere. And here we are today, 177 million lives saved by that invention. Truly remarkable. Pure food. So as I was searching around on the internet, I came across a great article that was in the style of the newspapers at the turn of the 20th century. It was entitled, "How Death Came Unbidden to Mrs. Sale's Dinner Party." The illustration was a skeleton serving a guest a plate of olives. So Mrs. Sales was a Detroit socialite, and she had a dinner party where she invited 8 of the most prominent and rich members of the Detroit elite. And a week later, 5 of them were dead. 2 of them got near death but recovered, including Mrs. Sales. And it turned out to be caused by olives that were not canned properly. So the canning practices of the day killed everyone at that dinner party. So those were the kind of events that led to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And this was the first act that I'm aware of that used the term adulteration of food, right? So it outlawed adulteration of food and drink. So you would think that something like that would be an easy pass through Congress, but things haven't changed that much. There was a senator from Georgia who suggested it should be called the Pure Foolishness Act. And he predicted that it would be a Trojan horse with a belly full of inspectors, spies, and informants. So I've been through some FDA inspections and some USDA inspections, and at times I think the senator might have had a point. But overall, there's no question that that was one of the great accomplishments of the progressive era, was the passage of that act. And it's really the basis of the confidence that we all feel in the food supply today. And IAFP had its origin at exactly the same time and out of that same progressive ethic. So it was founded in 1911 by dairy producers who realized that mothers were becoming reluctant to feed milk to their children because of the risk of food poisoning. And they realized that pure food was not just the right thing to do, but also great business. And they formed IAFP. And we're still all a part of that progressive legacy. And I think we should feel really lucky that we're able to earn a living in a field that makes the world a healthier and safer place. And I feel really lucky to be able to do that. So pure food and pure water created the miracle. You know, physicians, they gave a little assist at the end. They kind of finished it off. But it's engineers, chemists, food scientists, biologists, people like us that did this. And I think being in this building with all of the great examples of evolution around us, it reminds us what Darwin's great insight was, which is that little incremental changes over a long period of time can make a huge difference. And that's what's happened to virtually defeat infectious disease in the last century. And any further advances that we make will be made by people just like us, making food, making water just a little bit safer every year. So I'd like to wrap up by talking about one of my favorite science books. It's called The Ghost Map by Stephen Johnson. And I can't recommend this book strongly enough. So it's the story of a Victorian physician named John Snow and how he fought to understand the cholera outbreaks that were raging through London. So in John Snow's day, it was a regular thing for a cholera outbreak to occur. And 50,000 deaths from a cholera outbreak that was not unusual. 50,000 people at a time. I mean, it's really stunning. And in a city of just a few million people. So he's really one of my science heroes. He was the son of a laborer. He was the first of his family to go to college. And he took a liking to medicine and did great in it and opened a private practice. But he wasn't content just being a private physician. He loved the medical controversies of his day. And one of the really interesting ones when he first started his career was that they had just discovered that there was this compound called ether that had anesthetic properties. And it was really changing the way surgery could be done. Up until the discovery of ether, the only trait that mattered in a surgeon was how fast they were. Okay? But with ether, they were able to step back and take their time and be careful. But there were problems with ether. Sometimes the patient wouldn't go down. Sometimes they would wake up in the middle of the operation. That was to terrible results, obviously. Sometimes they never woke up. And they couldn't quite figure this out. And John Snow worked on this problem, and he invented an apparatus that allowed them to administer a defined dose of ether. And he had an algorithm for correcting for the effect of room temperature in the pre-air conditioning days. And using those two pieces of the algorithm plus the apparatus, he was able to totally control the dose of ether. And his device and his algorithm just spread across the world for anesthesia and surgery. And he became the anesthesiologist to the Queen. So you would think that would be enough for a guy, but he was still obsessed with the problem of cholera. And I think it's because cholera was devastating exactly the kind of neighborhoods that he grew up in. And he was now, from his work on ether, an expert in the diffusion of gases. And the predominant theory at John Snow's time for where disease came from is that it was caused by bad smells. Bad smell equals disease. Okay? It was called the miasma theory. And we now know that that's like a classic correlation-causation error, right? But at the time, that was driving the decisions that they were making about how to fight cholera, and it just wasn't going anywhere. But Snow realized that the pattern of infections around London didn't follow the pattern you would expect for a diffusion of a gas. And so he set to work on his theory of how this might go about, and he really developed one of the earliest versions of the germ theory of disease. So he suggested that cholera was caused by a self-replicating poison, and that poison got into the water supply out of the sewage system. And that turned out to be exactly right. But he wanted to prove this, and he kind of invented epidemiology on the fly to prove this. One of his great insights was that London was supplied with water by about 10 different water companies. And some of them, most of them actually, had their inlet pipes upstream of London, but there was one company called S&V Water Company, and they had their inlet pipe downstream of the sewer outlet. So he went around the city figuring out who was supplied by what water company, and then he followed cholera deaths over a few years. And he showed that almost all of the cholera deaths within London were coming from this one water company with the downstream inlet pump. Okay. So I'll get back to John Snow in a second, but I have to say a word about corporate responsibility here. So you didn't have to be a believer in the the germ theory of disease to think that drinking water that came from downstream of the sewer outlet was gross. And in Parliament, in fact, in 1850, passed a law saying everybody, all the water companies have to move their inlet pipe upstream of London. And they give them 5 years to do it. And some companies had already done it. Some companies immediately did it. But S&V Waterworks decided to save a little money and wait until the whole 5 years was up. Now, this provided Jon Snow with some great and important data, but S&V killed tens of thousands, literally tens of thousands of their customers. This is not a good business model. Don't be an S&V. So back to Jon Snow's story. So he was finishing his water company study and was convinced as to what was going on when the great cholera outbreak of 1854 took place. And he rushed to the center of the cholera outbreak. And he got together with the local pastor, and he immediately started making a map. And this is the ghost map of the book's title, of all of the deaths in this neighborhood. And he was able to tell from his map, the pattern in his map, that it was being caused by a single water pump, the Broad Street pump. So together, Snow and the pastor went to the Broad Street pump, and they removed the pump handle, and the outbreak died away. So you can go to London today, and you can see the Broad Street pump. It's sitting there without a handle as Jon Snow's great memorial. Next time you're in London, check it out. There'd only be one more cholera outbreak after Jon Snow published his study on the waterworks. And as London was slowly re-engineered to make sure that water and sewage stayed separate. So at BioFire, we have tests that test patient samples for pathogens, and one of them is cholera, actually. And we point physicians towards a way to cure those diseases. And it's really important work, and we're super proud of it. But our value comes after an infection has taken hold, and the patient's life is in danger, and that's too late. You guys do something better. You prevent the disease from taking place in the first place. And in human life and human health, prevention is so much better than cures. In medicine, we cure patients one at a time, but you guys save them in the hundreds and the thousands. And it's incredibly important work, and thank you for that. Your work has changed this century. So I think it was prevention that was in John Smith's mind when he got his wrench and headed down the street to the Broad Street pump. And I like to imagine him struggling with what must have been a rusty bolt until it finally breaks loose. And I wonder if, as he pulled the handle free, if he worried that he was making a mistake and that a lot of people would be mad that they didn't have access to pump water. And he probably did. But I hope that as he looked at the pump handle, he thought of the thousands of lives that he was saving. I hope that's what he was thinking about. I think he deserved to think about that. All of us in our careers, I suspect, will have moments when we are asked to decide whether to make a whole bunch of people angry by cutting off the supply of something they want to buy and that we want to sell them. And I've been involved in those decisions, and they're really hard. But I hope the next time that happens in your career, that you examine the evidence carefully, like Jon Snow did, and you don't worry too much about who you're going to make angry, like Jon Snow did. And if the decision is right and the time requires it, that you take off the pump handle. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Keep it going for Randy and Nicola as well.